morning, everyone. We're excited to have you all here with us today, so thank you for joining us. Today, our presenter is going to be discussing various civil rights issues applicable to public libraries. So if that's what you signed up for, you're in the right place. This webinar is eligible for one LEU. At the end of the webinar, the LEU certificate will be posted, and you'll be able to download the certificate and put your name on it. The slides will also be posted for download at the end of the webinar. Our speaker has a lot of content to deliver today, so there is going to be limited time at the end for questions. It's possible we may not get to everyone's questions, but you can always follow up directly with the Civil Rights Commission later. If you have sound issues, please see the sound issues box just below the chat box. If there's a global sound issue, we will announce it in the chat pod. If you're unable to resolve the sound issues you're experiencing, we are recording the webinar, so you can watch it offline after the meeting has ended. Again, if there's a global sound issue that affects everyone, we will make an announcement in the chat box. So without further ado, I will announce our speaker for today. Donisha Posey is currently the Deputy Director and General Counsel of the Indiana Civil Rights Commission. Ms. Posey serves as the Chief Legal Officer of the agency and oversees its team of staff attorneys responsible for all aspects of civil rights enforcement around the state. In addition, she manages the daily operations of the state agency. Ms. Posey was previously appointed as the Administrative Law Judge for the Indiana Civil Rights Commission. In her capacity as Administrative Law Judge, Ms. Posey presided over cases of discrimination in the areas of housing, employment, education, public accommodations, and credit. Prior to her appointment with the Indiana Civil Rights Commission, Ms. Posey practiced in the private sector in the areas of immigration and family law. Ms. Posey received her Juris Doctor from the Indiana University Robert H. McKinney School of Law, where she has since returned as an adjunct professor, teaching housing discrimination and segregation. Let's get started.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I love when you guys type in the chat box. Awesome. Mishawaka. It's sunny right now, Mishawaka? All right. So good morning. Again, my name is Donisha Posey. And the title of my presentation today is Who Let the Dogs In? Handling Service Animal Requests in a Public Accommodation. All right, so let's get started. So the overview today, I'm going to quickly talk about the Indiana Civil Rights Commission, what is our mission, and a quick overview of handling complaint processes. The primary focus today is service animals in the ADA and other assistance animal law under the Indiana state law. Then we'll talk about what is a disability under the law. We'll talk about prohibited conduct as a public accommodation or a state or local government entity. What are some valid denials for service animals or assistance animals? And then I'm going to end with some statistics on public accommodation discrimination that we've received at ICRC. All right. All right, so first, disclaimer, the information and materials here are intended solely as informal guidance and are neither a determination of your legal rights or responsibilities, nor binding on any agency with enforcement responsibility. So this is general information. If there are specifics, you can contact our office at any time to ask about any specific questions, but this is general guidance. All right, so what is the purpose of the Indiana Civil Rights Commission? The Civil Rights Commission is here for two distinct purposes. One, to enforce the Indiana Civil Rights laws, and two, to educate on your rights and responsibilities under the law. So as we enforce the law, we are primarily investigating thousands of complaints of discrimination that are sent to our office every year around the state of Indiana. And then educating. So what I'm doing right now is educating the public on their rights and responsibilities under the law. So our jurisdiction, the Indiana Civil Rights Commission enforces the Indiana Civil Rights Code, which is codified under Indiana Code 22-9, and also the Indiana Fair Housing Act, which is codified at 22-9.5. So our jurisdiction extends to pretty much everyone in the state of Indiana. So individuals, private or public entities, housing providers, business establishments, as long as they are within the state of Indiana or doing business within the state of Indiana. So, in the state of Indiana, not all discrimination is against the law, but a person may not be treated differently because of their race, color, gender, veteran status in certain employment issues, familial status, that's having children under the age of 18 in housing, national origin, ancestry, religion, and disability. I don't have age on there. Age is a protected class for employment, but it is not an area that the Indiana Civil Rights Commission will enforce. That is enforced by either the Department of Labor or the EEOC. So we talked about protected classes. What are the enforcement areas for the Indiana Civil Rights Commission? So we have jurisdiction to enforce equal opportunity in 5 specific areas. That's housing, employment, public accommodations, credit, and education. So if someone feels that they've been discriminated against, this is what the process looks like. They will call our office, they will go on our website, fill out an inquiry, or they might even show up to our office to do an intake interview. After they've done their interview, we will have a formalized complaint that they'll sign. If it's an employment case or if it's a housing case, it might be duly filed with either the EEOC or HUD, depending on if it's also within their jurisdiction. We will investigate the complaint. We'll have a finding whether we found cause or no cause for discrimination. And then the case may be mediated or conciliated if both parties are willing to do that. And then if not, if we found cause and there's no mediation, then the case will go into litigation. So that is just a general overview of what happens at the Indiana Civil Rights Commission. So now I want to bring your attention to one of our enforcement areas, which is public accommodations. So many of you either work in libraries or work in another setting that is open to the public. So you're at the right place, and we're talking about assistance animals, service animals, and public accommodations. All right, so we're going to talk about the applicable laws, both federally and statewide. There are kind of 3 big federal laws that are important for you all. Title II of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which allows all persons to be entitled to full and equal enjoyment of goods, services, facilities, privileges, advantages, and accommodations of any place of public accommodation. And then we also have Title II and Title III of the ADA. So Title II and Title III prohibits discrimination in state and local government services. That's Title II. And then Title III is all areas of public life, including jobs, school, transportation, and all public and private places that are open to the general public. So when you think about the federal law and what is important when determining if there is a discrimination issue, those are the federal statutes that you want to keep in mind. And within the state, what are we looking at in the state? So first we're going to look at Indiana Code 16-32-3, which talks generally about rights of blind and other physically disabled persons. So it is the public policy of the state of Indiana to allow anyone with a physical or mental disability the right to be accompanied by a service animal in any place of public accommodation. And then Indiana Code 22-9, which is the Indiana Civil Rights Act, prohibits discrimination in the 5 enforcement areas that I talked about, which includes public accommodations. All right, so today we're going to talk about 3 different areas, or 3 different types of animals, I would say, when we're talking about disability. Excuse me. First, we have service animals under the ADA and under the Indiana Code. And then we're going to talk briefly about the differences between an emotional support animal and then ending with a pet. So please bear with me for a second. I'm trying to pull up something else at the same time. Give me 1 second. All right, so under the ADA, what is a service animal? So the ADA says that a dog, and in certain exemptions, a miniature horse may also be a service animal. but this dog has been individually or specially trained to do work or perform tasks for an individual with a disability to mitigate said disability. So it is important to note that under the ADA, we are talking specifically about a dog, okay? However, Indiana law has expanded that definition to include additional animals. So that's a hearing animal, a guide animal, an assistance animal, a seizure alert animal, a mobility animal, a psychiatric service animal, or an autism service animal. Okay? So just keep in mind when you are talking about the law, you're talking about more than just the ADA, because we're all in the state of Indiana, which includes more animals. A lot of people kind of get confused on that, so just know that the federal law is the foundation, and states can go higher from that. And so in this instance, Indiana law has expanded what is a service animal. So how do I know if it is a service animal? Well, if it's not obvious what the service that animal provides, only limited inquiries are allowed. You can only ask 2 questions, right? The first question is the animal a service animal required because of a disability? And the second question is, what work or task has the animal been trained to perform? In no situation may you ask about the person's disability, nor should you require any medical documentation, nor require a special identification card or training document for the dog, or ask that the dog demonstrate its ability to perform the work or task. So please keep in mind, these are the only 2 questions that you may ask. All right, so now we've talked about service animals for a bit. Let's talk about emotional support animals. So under the ADA, emotional support animals are not considered service animals under the ADA, okay? An emotional support animal may help with depression, anxiety, certain phobias, but do not necessarily have special training to perform tasks that assist people with disabilities. The dog may also provide comfort. However, there is a caveat here that says, under Indiana law, an emotional support animal may fall under psychiatric service animal. So it's important to keep in mind the 2 questions that you're able to ask, because under the ADA, you might think, okay, only a guide dog or only a service animal, a service dog really, will be what we're allowed to, what we're required to allow in. But under Indiana law, service animal has been expanded, and an emotional support animal may fall under that psychiatric service animal expansion under Indiana law. So please keep that in mind. So pet. Everyone knows what a pet is, right? However, some people may use the term companion animal interchangeably with pet, but they also might use that term to explain an emotional support animal. So be sure to clarify. And what I mean by clarify is ask those 2 questions that we had a few slides ago. Those are the only 2 questions. People who present with a pet do not have any of the legal rights afforded to people with disabilities who have a service animal or emotional support animal. All right, so what is the definition of a disability? So the ADA lays it out for us. It's either a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, or someone has a record of an impairment, or that person is regarded as having an impairment. And we'll go a little bit deeper into this. So the first point, an impairment that substantially limits. So what we're talking about here is this person, we're talking about the performance in a major life activity compared to most people in the general population, okay? And we're talking about the effects of the impairment on the person's life. But notice here that we're not naming the impairment. The impairment is not necessarily the important thing here. It is how the effect of that impairment is on that person's life, okay? And we'll go even a little bit deeper here. So, what are these major life activities? So, a major life activity is an activity that most people can perform with little to no difficulty. So, caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, lifting, bending, speaking, breathing, learning, reading, thinking, communicating, working. So, these are major life activities. And this person may have a disability that limits one of those major life activities, okay? However, a life activity is also an operation of a major bodily function. So an animal can alert someone when that person may have diabetes with low blood sugar, or that animal can alert prior to the onset of a seizure, or in the presence of allergens present that create a threat to the handler's well-being. So when we're thinking about disability, we're thinking about those physical things that we talked about. So eating, seeing, breathing, thinking, communicating, reading, but we're also talking about major bodily functions, okay? So what are some of these invisible disabilities? Can we get some folks to type out in the chat, what do you think some invisible disabilities are? All right, so you guys are all correct. So let's talk about some of these indivisible disabilities. We got ADHD, AIDS or HIV, alcoholism, allergies, arthritis, asthma, cancer, chronic fatigue, color blindness, deafness or hard of hearing, diabetes, epilepsy, fibromyalgia, heart conditions, hemophilia, hepatitis, intellectual disabilities, migraines, multiple chemical sensitivity, psychiatric disabilities, PTSD, sleep disorders, TBI. So these are all indivisible disabilities that you may not be able to see from just talking to someone, right? Or just seeing someone. And this person might come into your library with their service animal. So what are some types of trainings that, when we're talking about these indivisible disabilities, but also the disabilities that you can see as well, what are some of the tasks that these animals may do? So if someone has autism, the service animal may do repetitive movement alerts. If someone is blind or low vision, they may help with orientation and mobility. If someone is deaf or hard of hearing, they may be alerting to auditory stimuli. And if there's a mobility disability, they might be pulling the wheelchair or retrieving objects or balance support. And if it's a psychiatric disability, they might have agitation warnings. They might be able to deter inappropriate behavior. And they might also give medication reminders. So just note, if the sole function of the animal is to provide comfort, it is probably not a service animal, okay? If it is solely to provide comfort, it is probably not a service animal. And also keep in mind, I'm giving these examples only as illustration. Many disabilities are hidden, and even though the need for the animal may not seem obvious, It doesn't mean that it is not a service animal. All right, so now we've talked a little bit about what is a service animal under the ADA and also under the Indiana law. Let's talk about the service animal handler's responsibilities. So the animal must remain under the handler's control, usually by a leash, but it is not mandatory that that animal be on a leash, okay? Because it might not be practical due to the nature of the disability or the task performed. And the animal also must be housebroken. All right? The handler must take corrective action in the event a service animal is aggressive or not behaving. And the handler is responsible for any damage or if the animal bites another individual or animal. And also just keep in mind, a working service animal isn't free to play, so please do not distract it while it's working. All right, so how can I exclude or remove a service animal? A person with a disability may not be asked to remove his service animal from the premises unless there's two ways that you can. One, if the animal is out of control and the handler does not take effective action to control it, or the animal is not housebroken. When there is a legitimate reason to ask that a service animal be removed, the staff must offer the person with a disability the opportunity to obtain goods or services without the animal's presence. Please keep that in mind. If there is a legitimate reason for asking that the animal be removed, you must then also offer that person with a disability the opportunity to obtain goods or services without the animal's presence. And I have a suggestion on the bottom. Please notify or get approval from a supervisor before requesting removal of a service animal. The supervisor should document the steps taken by staff and the reason for exclusion or removal. Again, I'm with the Indiana Civil Rights Commission. We get so many complaints every day of people claiming that they've been discriminated against on the basis of their disability because they were not allowed to have their service animal in, said public accommodation. If you are documenting and taking the proper steps, then there should be no reason that you would be fearful of any complaint that comes to our office, as long as you're taking the appropriate steps. All right, so I'm allergic to dogs, or I'm scared of, German Shepherds. Allergies and fear of dogs are not valid reasons for denying access or refusing service to people using service animals. Bottom line, there's really nothing else about that. You cannot deny someone because of your own allergies or your fear of dogs, or other patrons' allergies or patrons' fears of dogs. If you would like to accommodate that second person who is saying, okay, so the first person comes in who has a disability and they have their service animal. They're walking into your library, and then someone else who's already in the library or comes in later and says, hey, I am so allergic to cats, I need a EpiPen, or this could be really harmful for my allergies. At that point, you'll have to accommodate that person, right? So maybe separate the first person with a disability and that new person who has the allergy. You'll have to figure out a way to accommodate both people. All right, so what can I not require? You cannot require certification papers. You cannot require identification cards. You cannot require a vest, okay? There are no national organizations that have foolproof carte blanche stating that that animal is a service animal, okay? There is no affiliated national organization that either the ADA nor the state of Indiana approves to be, certified service animal anything, okay? But you can require proof of a license or vaccination, okay? So when I say a license, it depends on what kind of animal it is that might need a license to have in your state or your town. And you can also require proof of vaccination. So, what are valid denials? Again, according to the Americans with Disability Act, if the person with a disability does not control the animal, so if the animal is growling, uncontrolled barking, jumping on people, running away from the handler, you can deny or exclude that animal from the premises. If that animal is not housebroken and is being around your library, you can deny that person. You can not the person. I'm sorry. You can deny that animal entrance. Individualized assessment. So, is that animal a direct threat to health or safety of others? Okay, there is not a all size fits all here either. And then also with the miniature horse, what is the type, what is the size, and what is the weight of the horse? Is it an undue hardship for having that size of an animal in your space? So the next thing is the undue hardship, or is there a direct threat? And then again, you must offer the opportunity to that person to obtain the goods or services without the animal present. All right, again, when a person with a disability is asked to remove their service animal, I'm sorry, I put dog, but animal, the person with a disability must be given the option to stay. And a service animal should not be excluded permanently unless there is a significant reason for doing so. So think about continued barking in the library versus biting a patron. If a service animal is just barking continuously in the library and the handler is not able to get the dog to calm down, you might want to exclude the dog because you need quiet. You know, the library is supposed to be quiet. Everyone else should have peaceful enjoyment as well. So in that instance, you might want to have the handler or take the dog out. But this should not probably be a permanent exclusion. However, if a service animal bites a patron, that might be a reason why you want to permanently exclude that particular animal. All right, so I am zooming through these. I wanted to give you guys some complaints about public accommodation discrimination by protected class at the Civil Rights Commission. So I just gathered some data from 2013 until present to show you what kind of cases that we've received in the public accommodation enforcement area. So since 2013, we've had 204 disability-related public accommodation complaints, 30 national origin, 253 race, 27 sex, and 14 retaliation. All right. So I did want to leave a lot of time for questions because I know this is very fact specific. So I'm glad we have time for questions. I think we've been writing down a lot of these questions. So I'm just going to go through the questions as they come up.
Okay, the first question we have. I see she's been hitting a lot of these questions as we go. But one of the questions we have that hasn't been addressed is what happens if you have a dog or an animal that comes in that's dirty, bad hygiene, fleas that you can visibly see, how to handle that.
Okay. Yes, so I'm back to the slide, valid denial. If there is a direct threat to health or safety of others. So if this dog has fleas or has hygiene issues, you may exclude that animal.
Okay, another question we had was someone said that they were presented with paperwork for, I guess it was an emotional support animal from back in the 80s, and how long should the paperwork be accepted? Or it sounded to me like you said they don't really need paperwork at all.
No, so paperwork is not a valid entrance or a denial, right? We got to go back to the two questions. Let me go all the way back to what are the two questions that you can ask someone. Is the animal a service animal required because of a disability? And if they say yes, then you go to number two. What work or task has the animal been trained to perform? So when that person tells you what work or task that animal has been trained to perform, you can then make an assessment yourself. Okay, this is a disability this is related to a disability under the law. So if they're saying, oh, my service animal, let's just say my service animal presses buttons for me because I have issues with that, right? So the service animal may not be on a leash. It may not be a dog. It might be another animal that, maybe it's a monkey, right? So the monkey is able to press buttons for that person. So if you ask that person that what work or task has the animal been trained to perform, if they tell you that the animal does X, Y, and Z, then those are literally the only two questions you can ask. You cannot ask that the animal demonstrate its ability to perform the task. You cannot require special identification cards or training, and you cannot require medical documentation, right, about that person's disability. Okay?
Okay, so it's interesting you mentioned monkeys because somebody asked, is just about any animal allowed in Indiana?
So this is pretty much an untapped area of the law in Indiana. So the Indiana Code says animal. Let me go back to right here. So it says hearing animal, guide animal, assistance animal. They all end in animal, whereas the Americans with Disability Act specifically says dog, service dog, guide dog, hearing dog, right? So under Indiana law, it says animal, so it's animal until it says otherwise.
Okay, what about, do they need a policy in place for removing or ejecting problem animals, or just rely on the ADA?
I think it is a good idea to have a policy. A policy is very important because not everybody in your library is here for this training right now, right? So having a policy that lays out how your particular entity is going to deal with asking someone with a disability or their handler to remove the service animal is important. You can email me. My email address is at the end of this slide, and we can even help you with that policy.
Okay, so I guess there needed to be more clarification on how to determine an emotional support animal versus a pet. Somebody asked about that again, and then somebody mentioned, is it just the same two questions, or?
So yes, these are the only two questions you can ask. But I brought up emotional support animal because that's kind of a buzz phrase that people know. Nowadays people are saying emotional support animal, emotional support animal. Under the ADA, an emotional support animal is not a service animal, but under Indiana law, an emotional support animal may be a service animal. So under Indiana law, we have psychiatric service animal, right? So under the ADA, where it says a physical or mental disability that, let's go back right here, a dog or a miniature horse that has been individually or specially trained to do work or perform tasks for an individual with a disability. So here it's expanded to say definitely a hearing animal, definitely a guide animal, assistance animal. But when we get to psychiatric service animal, that might be where one would consider emotional support animal to be a psychiatric service animal. So if someone has an invisible disability, say they have a psychiatric disability, and it's not apparent to you that that animal that they have provides a service, you ask them, is the animal a service animal required because of a disability? If that person says yes, you cannot ask them what their disability is. The only thing you can ask from there is, what work or task has the animal been trained to perform? And it's the animal been trained to perform. So if they are saying, oh, well, he provides me comfort when I'm feeling stressed out, it doesn't sound like that animal's been trained. So therefore, that animal is not a service animal under the ADA nor Indiana law. If they say, even if they can offer to you and tell you what their disability is, but they don't necessarily have to. So if they say, I have PTSD, this animal gives me support when I am triggered by, my PTSD. Then, and you ask, oh, so that animal has been trained to perform that task? And if they say yes, then you must allow that animal in.
What about service dogs in training? Are those allowed?
Service dogs in training. Yes. So under the Indiana law, if someone is training that service animal, so that person does not have a disability, but that person is training an animal to be trained to perform a task, a work or a task for someone with a disability, then under Indiana law, that person should be allowed into your establishment.
Okay, and then somebody asked which animals require a license. I think you mentioned something about licenses earlier.
So I'm not an expert on what animals require licenses. I mean, I can just make this up. I think maybe like certain type of snakes need licenses, or a lion, or exotic or wild animals probably need licenses, and I think it might also vary from state to state, or town to town, municipality by municipality.
So somebody asked, and I think you may have just talked about this, do psychiatric service animals have to perform a task? And kind of piggybacking on that, somebody said emotional support animals aren't trained to perform a task, so how do they deal with that? So I guess kind of similar.
So an emotional support animal that is not trained to perform a task is not required. You are not required to allow that animal in. So I brought up emotional support animals because when people think about emotional support animals, let's go here, they're thinking about an animal providing some sort of comfort. So if someone has depression or anxiety or a phobia, that animal might help with providing comfort. Okay? But people use this term interchangeably, emotional support animal with a comfort animal, but they also use this term when identifying something else, something bigger, right? So like a psychiatric service animal. So again, I bring it up because it's kind of its own bucket, emotional support animal, where that animal might fit into the pet bucket of being a companion animal, of helping someone, even if they have a disability, but helping them cope with their disability, but not necessarily trained to help them cope with that disability.
Okay. She said, where do we go to find out?
Go to find out. Someone asked about the slide with the... So again, here's the psychiatric disability. So an animal might be trained to deter inappropriate behavior. An animal might be trained to give a reminder for when they need to take their medication, okay?
So somebody says, what if the animal is trained for tasks that have nothing to do with the library?
It doesn't matter. It's still their service animal. The library doesn't have anything to do with it, right? So if I have a psychiatric disability and my support animal helps me with that, like helps me determine when I need to take my medication, I might not need to take my medication at any point in time that I'm in your library, but it's still my service animal. It still goes with me where I go.
The specific example she gave was they help with the laundry. I don't know.
Okay.
Maybe that's not relevant to the analysis anyway. But...
Yep, it's not. I mean, you go back to your two questions. Is this a service animal? Is this animal a service animal required because of a disability? Yes. What work or task is this animal trained to do? Trained to help me do my laundry.
So somebody's asking, is it legal to send this PowerPoint slide presentation to the person that the library represents? I'm not really sure what they're asking. Then they said, can the slides be sent by email to me or any of the participants? So the slides are going to be posted at the end of the webinar, so you can download them, and at some point this webinar is going to be posted on the State Library website. So there is going to be public dissemination of the slides, if that's the concern.
So it says, what if the handler leaves the dog with a friend and goes outside? So the animal must remain in the care of the handler, okay? So if the handler leaves the dog with someone else and they leave, then you may ask that person to remove the service animal when they leave.
A lot of questions about the emotional support animals.
I mean, I'm not going to sit up here and say it's cut and dry, because it's not. It's when dealing with disabilities, you have to be very sensitive and to avoid asking someone what is their disability, or delving too deep into any of that, right? So those two questions are the only two legal questions that you can ask someone with a disability.
Okay, and then somebody asked to go back to the slide about what's not required, but that's the slide, right?
Yes.
It's already up. Okay, so you've already got that. Okay, somebody says, our county has a leash law throughout the county. Can an animal be leash-free under this condition?
Yes. So when we are thinking about service animals, we cannot equate them with pets, right? A service animal is equipment, really, to help someone with a disability. So when someone has a wheelchair, that is their equipment that helps them with their disability. If someone has a guide dog, that is equipment to help them with their disability, right? So you have to think of it in the same way as a wheelchair, right? So if someone has a wheelchair, are you going to ask them what brand of wheelchair is that? We only allow certain wheelchair brands, right? The same way you won't ask someone with a service animal what breed of pet is that. We only allow certain breeds into our establishment. You have to think about it in the same way as equipment.
Somebody asked, does it matter who's doing the training of the future service animal? I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. So does the person who is saying that they are training a service animal, do they have to be a licensed trainer or something like that? That's a good question. The statute does not say specifically about that. It just says an animal in the course of being trained to be a service animal should be also allowed into an establishment. Great question. I will look into that and get back to you all. Is there a way that I can?
You can, yeah, I've got everybody.
Okay.
I'll have a list of everybody that's on here and their contact information. So if you want to send me something to send to them, I can do that. Somebody says, so basically in Indiana, with it being any animal and no certification, we pretty much have to let them in so long as people say, yep, of course it's trained to alert me to whatever. And our only recourse is if it's not under control or has fleas and such, because there's no certification.
Correct.
What if the handler leaves the dog with a friend and goes outside?
Yeah, we talked about that.
Okay.
So, and then I think Chris Jackson said something else. But note that the handler can be a caregiver and not the person with a disability.
Okay.
That is correct. The person with a disability is not always the handler.
Okay, somebody says thanks for the slides. They're going to be helpful to pass out at the next staff meeting. Are there any questions? I think I've got everything so far, but if I've missed somebody, if you could just retype your question so we can make sure we get to it. I'll give you guys a minute or two. Looks like people are pretty much done. Okay, well, thanks everybody for attending, and I want to thank Denisha for the very informative webinar and for taking time to do this for us. Again, if we didn't get to your question, please feel free to reach out directly to the Indiana Civil Rights Commission. We're going to turn off the webinar now and put the LEU certificate up for you all to download, as well as the presentation slides.
And before we go, I have two more. I saw two more questions
Okay.
come in. One about rabies vaccinations. Yes, you may ask about vaccinations. You may ask for vaccinations. And two, let's just say, if we write a policy and we want you to take a look at it, should we send a specific subject in the email? It doesn't matter. Just send me an email saying, you know, policy for service animals in the library or something. It doesn't matter, and I will respond. And I did not say that it doesn't matter who's provided the training. So who's provided the training? You cannot ask more specifically, what company did you use to provide training for your animal? The two questions that I presented are the only two questions that you can ask, okay?